Yo guys, what is going on? JPS back with another video, and today we're going to be reacting to why Britain advanced before other European nations. Hit the like button guys, hit subscribe, and consider joining the Patreon. First link in the description for full reactions to British shows and movies. Speaking of British shows and movies, we just started a new show over on Patreon, Skins. Just watched the first episode and really enjoyed that. Along with new movies, today we watched The Lady Killers, which was a fantastic film, and I really enjoyed that following our reaction to Kind Hearts and Coronets. So if you're interested in any of that, guys, first link in the description to join the Patreon. I would really appreciate the support. Without further ado, let's get into this and see why Britain advanced before other European nations.
Patterns of conquest have not been determined solely by technology or even by culture in general. Geography, including disease environments, has played a major role in the history of conquest, as it has in the history of cultural evolution in general. The steppes of Central Asia and the plains of Eastern Europe have been far better settings for cavalry charges than the mountainous terrain of the Balkans or the heavily forested parts of Central Europe, while island nations such as Britain and Japan have of course been wholly immune. China tried to create the effects of natural barriers with its Great Wall, as Hadrian's Wall in Britain and the Maginot Line in pre-war France attempted the same thing on a smaller scale. Geographic barriers have spared some peoples from conquest or delayed its coming. Mountainous terrain has permitted independence to persist in some places long after the adjoining lowlands have been overrun by invaders. Morocco, Ceylon, Abyssinia, Scotland, and Tibet are just some of the places in which this has been so. However, geographical barriers have been a mixed blessing, as technological and cultural backwardness have likewise been the fates of many of these isolated regions. Moreover, the relative poverty of such regions has also been one of the deterrents to conquest, along with the fighting abilities of mountain men, for there was little or no profit to be had from the conquest of many such areas. Differential resistance to one another's diseases, which played a key role in the conquest of the Western Hemisphere, retarded the conquest of Africa until much later in history, because it was the indigenous peoples who succumbed to new, mixed disease environments in the Americas, while it was the Europeans who were fatally vulnerable to the diseases of tropical Africa until quinine and other modern medical and public health measures made it possible for them to survive amid the tropical diseases that flourished south of the Sahara. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans long protected the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere from the conquerors of the rest of the world, and, even as late as the first half of the 20th century, these oceans made isolationism a viable option for the United States, as it was not for most of the nations of Europe or Asia. However, smaller bodies of water may facilitate rather than impede military attacks, for huge differences between the high cost of land transport and the low cost of water transport can be as important militarily as it has been economically. During the Crimean War, for example, the British and the French attacking forces were supplied by water, while the Russian defenders at Sevastopol had to be supplied by land, since the waters were controlled by British and French warships. Even with approximately 125,000 peasant carts requisitioned to supply the defenders from their own adjacent homeland, their limited supplies of ammunition did not permit them to reply in kind to the barrages fired at them from the sea. Nor was this simply a matter of conditions favoring attackers or defenders in general. Both in Spain and in Russia, Napoleon's attacking armies met disaster when they had to be supplied over land, while the opposing armies were supplied across water. The inaccessibility of African rivers to ocean-going warships made this continent less vulnerable to European naval power than much of the Western Hemisphere was. The Dutch, for example, could send ocean-going vessels more than 100 miles up the Hudson River to establish an outpost at what would later become the city of Albany. No river in Africa was that accessible, whether due to insufficient water levels or, more commonly, sandbars, cascades, and waterfalls. The shallow coastal waters in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa meant that large European warships could often not get close enough to the shore in many places, necessitating the loading of European troops into smaller boats, which could in many places be effectively opposed by Africans in similar-sized boats, particularly in the early centuries before European firearms had developed the accuracy and speed of firing that they would have in later eras. The history of the British people, like the history of other peoples around the world, illustrates the enormous importance of human capital, whether in the form of specific skills, general education, or traditions and laws that facilitate both economic development and the development of free institutions. The many centuries that it took for the British to rise from cultural and economic backwardness to the forefront of world civilization in technology and political dominance suggests something of the difficulty of acquiring the necessary human capital. The vital role played in this process by numerous other peoples who came to the British Isles, whether as conquerors, immigrants, or refugees, also suggests how important cultural diffusion is. The Romans, the Normans, the Jews, the Lombards, and the Huguenots all contributed in important ways at different historical junctures to what would ultimately become a British achievement. The geography of the British Isles also played an important role, not in determining what people would do, but in determining the boundaries of what was possible. The simple fact that Britain is an island nation, and that water transport is vastly cheaper than land transport, and was especially so in the era before railroads, meant that the British could transport heavy raw materials like coal to different parts of the United Kingdom much more cheaply and rapidly than was possible within nations with large interiors such as Germany or the United States, both of which had to wait for the era of railroads to challenge the British in industrialization. The fact that the key raw materials of the industrial age, iron ore and coal, were located very near each other and also near navigable waterways in Britain, again gave the British decisive early advantages over countries like Germany and the United States, as well as permanent advantages over regions of the world where such natural resources do not exist at all and cannot be imported at any feasible economic cost. Significantly, Japan, one of the few countries that was later able to rise to the industrial forefront without such natural resources, is an island like Britain, and no part of Japan is more than 70 miles from the sea, so imported raw materials could be brought in economically.
It's easy to overlook that, but I'm always reminded of it and always in such awe at how close in proximity any place in the UK is to water. You could be in the middle of England and you're still very close to water, especially by my standards. I mean, there's people in the United States, they would have to drive multiple days to reach ocean, of course. I mean, there's lakes and rivers if we're talking about smaller bodies of water, but here we're talking about larger bodies of water where trade is feasible. So it's easy to overlook that, but that's true. Location plays a big factor in economic growth, and especially in this case, the early economic growth that they're talking about, because the United States, not very easy to get coal all the way across the country, you know what I mean? Especially before railroads, and we still have crappy rails. I think every country's always going to be complaining about the rails, no matter what the situation is.
Raw materials could be brought in economically, as would be virtually impossible in the Balkans or in much of sub-Saharan Africa, for example, due to more formidable geographical barriers in these places. Geographical advantages and cultural imports have permitted more to be accomplished within the British Isles than in many other parts of the world, but ultimately it was the British themselves who had to accomplish it. That they did so has had enormous consequences, not only for the inhabitants of the United Kingdom, or even for past and present members of the British Empire or Commonwealths, but for the entire world. The highly varying degrees to which different segments of the British population acquired the necessary human capital demonstrates that the opportunity alone is not sufficient for economic or other accomplishments. Nor was it simply a matter of what the existing society permitted to different groups, for those same groups showed similar economic and social patterns when transplanted to other societies in North America or in Australia and New Zealand. British law and its traditions of impartiality made London a magnet for the capital of the world, enabling Britain to industrialize with other people's capital as well as its own. In a later era, the British colony of Hong Kong would similarly attract capital from around the world by the dependability and impartiality of its laws, while many poverty-stricken countries were unable to obtain much-needed capital because of their undependable laws and confiscatory policies toward foreign investors. British law was of course more than an economic asset. Its separation of powers and rights of citizens against the government were the foundation of the freedom of the British themselves. The revolutions of the 17th century, including the beheading of King Charles I in 1649 and the uprisings in 1688 that led James II to flee to France, made the separation of powers even more dramatically vindicated and an indelible part of the British Constitution. While many other countries copied British systems of law and government, those that succeeded in creating similarly free governments were largely those that came from the same tradition. The United States, Canada...
I was literally... Y'all saw the look I gave before he even said that. I was like, well... We've taken maybe a couple pages out of your guys' playbook. We've looked it over and we've made it better. We made it better. Oh man, I think that's gonna wrap this up. Let's see.
Australia, New Zealand.
Yeah. It's gonna name all the other countries that. So yeah, that was why Britain advanced before other European nations. Honestly, this is a really interesting video. I didn't want to commentate or talk too much during because I was actually learning a lot throughout this and trying to take it in. But it's kind of just goes into the history of why that happened. And a lot of this stuff has to do with what was emphasized at the beginning of the video, geography. And there's nothing you could do about geography. Where you're born or where that country is where that country is. And it benefits it. To Africa, it was really the downfall of a lot of African countries, unfortunately, because of the scramble for Africa. You have tons of different European nations pulling Africa at every end possible because of its amazing natural resources. Still has a ton of natural resources, but then you see all these, and I don't want to sound like, oh, all of Africa is poor. Every country in Africa is poor. There's nothing we can do, blah, blah, blah. Because it's easy to say that as if it's this huge statement that's wrapping over and across the entirety of Africa. No, I don't want to say that, but there are specific nations in Africa that are incredibly impoverished, and it's a very unfortunate situation. And that's not, Africa. I mean, it happens in tons of different places all around the world, but it's really unfortunate, and fortunate for other countries that were able to conquest successfully and take natural resources from. Like I said, this goes on and on. So I think a lot of it is just chalked up to human nature. Humans are always going to want more. Humans are always going to be looking for the next thing or trying to progress, which speaks to how our world has progressed so much recently and throughout time. So who knows where that's going to end up. Soon we'll be having the AI wars, and it'll be about geography to the closest servers and stuff. I mean, do you guys see how stupid it is? It's not it. Do you see how us humans, man, we're always up to something. So anyways, that was why Britain advanced before other European nations. Pretty interesting video. Definitely got me thinking. And I hope you guys enjoyed it too. So hit the like button, hit subscribe, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Peace.